Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating text, Carl Jung's Psychology and Religion. Now, if you think you know Jung as, just this philosopher of the mystical, well, get ready to have your perspective entirely shifted. In this explainer, we're going to look at his strictly empirical, scientific approach to the absolute mysteries of the human mind. We're talking about how invisible psychological forces shape our reality, our health, and even our entire societies. Honestly, this material completely shifted how I view things, and I am so eager to unpack these mysteries with you. Let's get right into it. To kick things off, I want you to consider a really strange question. Can an imaginary illness kill you? We usually think of imaginary as, meaning fake or harmless. Our modern materialist bias basically tells us that if a doctor can't find a tumor on an X-ray, or if a blood test comes back clear, well, there's nothing wrong with you. We tend to believe that only physical things are real. But what if something that exists solely in your mind has the power to completely destroy your life? Hold on to that thought for a second, because it is literally the gateway, understanding Jung's entire framework. To understand how Jung answers that question, we actually first need to look at how he defines a word we use every single day. See, Jung doesn't define religion as a specific dogmatic creed or some set of rigid beliefs. Instead, tracing it back to the original Latin term religere, he defines religion as a careful and conscientious observation of what he calls the numinosum. So it's not about blind faith at all. It's a deeply scientific, almost cautious observation of incredibly powerful psychological phenomena that we simply cannot control. Okay, so what exactly is this numinosum? Well, Jung describes it as a dynamic effect or existence that is absolutely not caused by an arbitrary act of your own will. Think of it as an autonomous force, whether that's external or internal, that literally seizes and controls the human subject. When you experience the numinosum, you are its victim, not its creator. You're suddenly possessed by a mood, an idea, or a fear that you didn't ask for, and you definitely cannot easily turn off. This brilliantly illustrates a huge clash in how we view human existence. On one side, right, we have the modern medical view. This view often treats the psyche as a mere epiphenomenon, basically just a secondary, meaningless byproduct of brain chemistry. So if you have a psychological disturbance, this perspective says there absolutely must be a physical, organic cause, even if we just don't have the tools to see it yet. But Jung strongly contrasts this with his psychological argument. He says the psyche is our only immediate form of existence. Literally everything we know about the physical world, matter, our bodies, our environment, it only reaches us through psychic images. Therefore, the psyche is intensely real. To drive this point home, Jung uses one of my absolute favorite analogies. He simply states an elephant is true because it exists. He argues that an elephant isn't a logical conclusion, right? And it isn't a subjective opinion created by the human intellect. It's simply a phenomenon. Jung says we have to treat psychological ideas exactly the same way. An idea or a fantasy is psychologically true simply because it exists in the mind as a phenomenon. Just because it isn't made of solid matter doesn't mean it isn't a completely real, observable fact. Now, looking at his original Portuguese text, Psicologia y Religión, it is absolutely vital to remember Jung's positioning here. He insists repeatedly that he is acting strictly as an empiricist and a scientist, observing concrete psychic facts. He is not, I repeat, not, acting as a philosopher making logical guesses or metaphysical leaps. He's a doctor. He's documenting what he actually sees happening in his patients' minds, treating mental phenomena with the exact same objective seriousness a zoologist would give to that elephant. Okay, let's dive into this. Jung grounds this theory with a pretty chilling clinical anecdote from his own practice. He describes a highly intelligent, rational man who is absolutely convinced he has intestinal cancer. Now, the physical tests prove definitively that there is no physical cancer there at all, but the man continues to assert in this desperate, almost pleading voice that he has it, even while his conscious, intelligent mind admits it must just be a product of his fantasy. Which brings us to a really terrifying question for this patient. Where exactly does this morbid imagination come from? I mean, if he knows it's a fantasy, why can't he just stop thinking about it? This leads to a profoundly humiliating realization for the modern rational person. You are not the master of your own house. And here is where we get into Jung's concept of psychological complexes. The man's conscious ego is being overthrown by an intruder, an idea that possesses him completely, bypassing all of that formidable intellect. Jung actually tells us how he would address this patient, and it is a staggering diagnosis. He says, "Yes, my friend, you suffer from a cancerous disease. You harbor a mortal evil that will not kill your body, but will eventually kill your soul." Just let that sink in for a moment.
Because the fantasy is imaginary, sure, it won't destroy his physical organs. But because it is a very real psychological phenomenon, it acts exactly like a malignant tumor in his mind. It destroys his human relationships, his happiness, and slowly swallows his entire psychic existence. This chilling diagnosis perfectly illustrates what Jung calls the autonomy of the unconscious. These psychological complexes, they're not things we create on purpose. They are formations that grow completely spontaneously in the dark of the unconscious. They then infiltrate our consciousness, acting almost like secondary personalities with their own strange, immutable logic. And honestly, most frighteningly for us moderns, they absolutely cannot be controlled by reason. You cannot argue a psychological complex out of existence, just like you couldn't argue with a physical tumor. Jung contrasts this modern hubris with ancient understanding. Our modern hubris is basically our arrogant reliance on pure intellect. The patient believed he could order his entire world with his powerful mind, essentially abusing his reason for his own ego. But the unconscious pushed back. Jung actually compares this to the ancient Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero's immense hubris and presumption trigger the gods to create a powerful rival just to humble him. When we arrogantly believe we control everything, the autonomous forces of the unconscious will forcefully react to put us right back in our place. All right, now let's zoom out a bit from the individual clinical level to humanity as a whole. Jung illustrates these concepts through his real-world encounters with primitive tribes on the slopes of Mount Elgon in Africa. He wanted to understand the perils of the soul, basically the inherent dangers of our psychic reality, by observing people who haven't yet built up those massive, arrogant, intellectual defenses of the modern Western world. And what he found was that primitive people are incredibly aware of the dangers lurking in the unconscious. Because they actually recognize this danger, primitive cultures have developed highly specific precautions against psychological harm. They take physical actions to avoid triggering sudden violent psychic outbursts, what we might call losing consciousness to an emotion or a complex. They speak softly to avoid startling the unseen forces. They drop weapons, they crawl on the ground, they bow their unshielded heads to show submission. And the profound irony here is that these primitive peoples respected the absolute danger of the unconscious mind way more than modern humans do today. This respect takes the form of strict rules, which we really see in the taboo of Selateni. Jung shares this fascinating anecdote from his time with the tribe. He casually mentioned the word Selateni, which translates to spirit. Instantly, the entire group fell into a terrified silence. They literally averted their eyes. Just by speaking the word aloud, Jung had carelessly invited a highly dangerous, uncontrollable psychic force into their presence. For them, taboos aren't just silly superstitions. They're vital, necessary protective barriers for the mind against unseen numinous dangers. And there was a really remarkable shift happening in this tribe at the time. Jung learned that the tribe's medicine man claimed he had completely stopped having dreams. Why? Because the British commissioner had recently arrived. You see, the dreams used to be the absolute voice of the unknown, the numinous power telling them about wars, sickness, and where to live. But once the British commissioner took over as the supreme political and organizational authority, well, the medicine man's unconscious no longer needed to serve that function. The commissioner essentially became his new god, the new bureaucratic voice of the unknown. It's fascinating. Now, what's really interesting about this next point is a famous, often completely misunderstood declaration from Jung: "I do not believe, I know." Now, this isn't a statement of blind faith. It is the ultimate conclusion of his empirical method. Just like a botanist knows plants exist because they observe them, Jung knows these powerful, autonomous, numinous forces exist because he has observed their undeniable manifestations in his patients and, honestly, in humanity across history. It's a certainty born of hard evidence, not doctrine. And this brings us to Jung's most dire warning. When individuals gather in crowds, these autonomous forces scale up terrifyingly. It triggers the eruption of the collective unconscious. The sheer mass of people awakens dormant beasts and demons in the human psyche. When a crowd forms, individual morality and intellect absolutely plummet, and autonomous primitive forces hijack the masses. Jung points out that these mass psychological disturbances, like the political upheavals and fanaticisms he witnessed in the 20th century, are vastly deadlier, taking far more lives than physical epidemics like cholera or smallpox. Which leaves us with a critical, lingering question. What autonomous forces are operating in your own mind right now? We all like to think we're entirely in control, purely rational beings driving our own ship, right? But as Jung's empirical evidence shows, invisible forces, complexes, ideas, and numinous effects are constantly shaping our reality from just below the surface. So take a moment today to carefully observe your own mind.
you might just find the unknown staring back. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you think you know.